Starting.
Okay, we are live, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session. Today we have some changes. We will be switching to a role-based model, as good architectures are. So I will be your host today. And we will have one QA manager, Nigel. We will have one speaker presenter, Michael, and the user group and news presenter, which is Pavel. And we will have some drinks at the end of the session. So please do stay to have some drinks and mingle later on. The agenda for today, we'll have a welcome at 5:50. Yeah, we are a bit late. At 6, we have already started the streaming and recording. So this event is streamed by Zoom and also through YouTube. So if you or some people cannot get in, you can do so through YouTube. And later on, there will be a recording there. At 6:05, in 3 minutes, we will perform the user group introduction and user group business of the Zurich developers user group and events to come. And at 6:10, we will start with the future of Xamarin with Brandon Minnick, academic code traveler. Later on, at around 7:20, we will do the Q&A, questions and answers. And around 7:45, we will close the streaming and recording, and we will grab a beer or drink of your choice and have a drinks and mingle session. So hope this is the first time we do that, so I hope this will be interesting for you. So we finish a bit ahead of time, and I hand over to Pavel. Please, can you take over?
Okay, you just need to stop sharing.
Yeah, basically you can take over, but
okay. So let's try this one and try this one. So can everyone see the presentation? Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Pavel Nivolny, and I have the pleasure to present you our user group. But first of all, I would like to say special thank you to our sponsors, without which this event couldn't take place. Our gold sponsors offering solution software, BBV and Fortecture. We also have partners from other user groups. This meeting is organized in collaboration with 2 other user groups, the .NET user group Zentralschweiz, that is led by Dani and Urs, and also by .NET user group Bern, that is led by René. So .NET user group Zurich, we are developers and we organize it for you, other developers. We like aspect of sharing knowledge and excitement about the technology that is created with it. Usually, then when we meet, networking is included. But since today we try to do it online, then at the end we'll try to do some online networking. So stay tuned. Who is standing behind? So today we have 7 people behind. It's Jose, it's me, it's Michael, Nigel, Laurent, Fabian, and Mark. So what we do, we try to do the events regularly, and with that, I mean the quality talks, speakers, and the content. We do the networking and the beer. And since recently, we also start to stream and publish events online. What you can do, you can follow us on the Twitter. This is our Twitter handle, the .NET Zurich. You can join our meetup group, tell your peers and help us to grow, and of course, propose content and the speakers. Today, we do the event through Zoom and the YouTube. If the Zoom is not working for you, if you have the question, please post it on the Slido. The link was provided to you in the meetup description. And if you wish, we also kindly ask you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And we would like also to remind that any Zoom bombing will be removed immediately from the session. coming soon. So please also note that soon we will have a session from the JetBrains, and it will be actually the 2 sessions, one with the Matthias Koch and Matt Ellis. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, and join us on June 2nd. Also, we want you to give a talk to the community, and especially for that we created an event on July 28th. It's called Lightning Talks, and the idea is pretty simple. We want to give the place here to present your idea, your project, your the technology you're working with, and you will have like 10 to 15 minutes. And yeah, we hope it will be lots of fun. At the moment, we are at the time of calling for papers. So if you go to our meetup page and to the event on the 28th of July, you will find a link where you can submit your talk. And yeah, we hope to see you there. And once again, a special thank you to our sponsors, and I give my voice back to Jose. So check. Wow. Stop showing.
Hi, Jose, you're unmuted.
Yes, I was not able to unmute me, but somebody did, so thank you. Thanks, Paulo. I mean, we had to start at 6:05, not end at 6:05. That was really fast. Thank you. So we are honored to welcome Michael Stape as part of our team of coordinators of the Zurich Developer User Group. So please welcome me in saying welcome, Michael. It's good to have you on the team. As you can see in the slides, he did not know that before, so it's a surprise. And I give you the word so you can introduce Brandon.
Yeah, I actually met Brandon when he, or I didn't met him in person. I would have at NDC Porto, but unfortunately, because of Corona, we actually only met online. And I actually noticed that there is one developer at Microsoft that is interested in GraphQL, so that's how I connected with him. And if you watch the talk by Brandon already, he's one of the most enthusiastic speakers. And even if you don't like Xamarin at this moment, I promise you after his talk you will, because he really can push very good vibes in his talks. And with that, I give the word to Brandon. And
all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's very kind words. I'll tell you what, let me flip on my screen and let's see, share. Give me a thumbs up when you can see it and we'll get rolling. All right. Let's go ahead and make this full screen. There we go. Okay, well, thanks so much for joining me today, everybody. I do want to start with a giant caveat. I'm excited about .NET MAUI. I'm sure that's why a lot of folks are here today, because you're curious about it, excited about it too. But everything we talk about today is still up for discussion. So we will do a deep dive into the MAUI code base. We'll see how we have it architected right now. But those are just our ideas. The team, and actually it's not, I shouldn't say our, because I didn't have much to do with it, but the Xamarin team, the really smart engineers, people smarter than me, have come up with this really cool idea that we'll be chatting about with .NET MAUI. But it's all still up for discussion, and everything is open source, just like Xamarin. MAUI is totally open source. Everything's done in the open. And if you want to give feedback, if you see something that can be improved, or you see something that we're doing and you're saying, whoa, nobody should ever do that, do jump in. There's the MAUI GitHub repo has a bunch of issues open where you can comment on features or kind of the architecture that we'll be chatting about today. So if you find this video and the year is 2021 or even later in 2020, when we do release Maui as a part of .NET 6, that should be .NET 6 preview should be out later this year. I think around November is the time frame. Do know that what we're talking about now is still in the planning phase. So don't hold me to anything because things can change. That being said, I want to point out 2 links at the bottom of the slides that you'll see today. These are on the bottom of just about every slide. And let's see, the bottom left is my Twitter handle. If you have any questions or you want to reach out, ping me, hit any speed bumps with Xamarin, you want to chat, happy to chat. I'm also a big fan of GraphQL, big fan of async and await. If you want to chat about that stuff, feel free to shoot me a message. My direct messages are always open. This is the best way to contact me because I personally hate email. On the bottom right, this is a web page I put together for us today. This is pretty much the summation of this session. So this is where you'll be able to find the slides. I have also put together a bunch of links. So if you're interested in Xamarin.Forms, .NET MAUI, I've linked together a bunch of documentation and also videos. There was an awesome video where I learned a ton that James Clancy, one of our longtime Xamarin engineers, super smart guy, he put together a live stream with another one of our engineers, Sweeky, where they dive into the MAUI source code, show how it all works. It's beautiful. It's, I think, 2 or 3 hours long, but it's on YouTube, so you can crank it up to 2x speed and get through it pretty quickly. I know I really enjoyed it. So all of that information is there on this webpage. So don't worry about memorizing anything. And this is also being recorded, so I'll make sure to post a link to the recording on that page as well. Oh, and one more thing. Start asking your questions now. There is a lot of curiosity around .NET MAUI. So I want to be guided by what you want to see. I know there's been a lot of announcements. There's been some videos, like I just mentioned, with James Clancy diving deep into the code. So maybe you know stuff about it, maybe you don't, but start asking those questions now. The team will make sure to get those funneled into me. And then we can kind of guide the MAUI conversation towards where you need to see it instead of just kind of rehashing information you maybe already know. All right. Well, that being said, as you're asking your questions, I want to share with you what's new in Xamarin.Forms, because Xamarin.Forms isn't going away today. In fact, it's not going away for a long time. It is evolving into MAUI, but MAUI, like we mentioned a minute ago, won't be released in preview with .NET 6 until later this year. And then .NET 6 won't be pulled out of preview, put into what we call GA or general availability until the following year. So we have a lot of time between now and then. And I have gotten a bunch of questions about, wow, this MAUI stuff looks great. I'm building a new app starting today. What do I use? And the answer is still Xamarin.Forms. And that's mostly because MAUI doesn't even exist in preview yet. So none of us can build apps in MAUI, but Xamarin.Forms will be here. We will have the current version of Xamarin.Forms is 4.6. We will be releasing a V5, and then that'll continue to be supported until we have MAUI up and running. So what is new in Xamarin.Forms? Here's some things to get excited about if you haven't already. 4.6 is the latest stable release, and there are more goodies in 4.6. I've included a link to the release announcement on that website at the bottom of the slides. But what I've done, I've kind of cherry picked a couple that I know I'm really excited about. Some I have had a chance to play around with, some I haven't yet. But the first one is this expander. So this has been, say a common request I've heard. I actually used to work at Xamarin. That's how I made it to Microsoft, because Microsoft acquired us a couple of years ago. But when I worked at Xamarin, I worked one-on-one with fellow developers a lot as a customer success engineer. And a lot of questions I got were, how do I do this? How do I have this expanding, almost like a tree subview UI? And for the longest time, my answer was just, don't do it. It's going to be too much of a headache. And you know what? It's mobile. This is usually like expanding lists like this is usually a desktop thing. Don't bother with it. But then we start seeing more and more apps coming out with it and having this expanding view. And so now it's baked into Xamarin.Forms. So if you have any interest in doing it, or maybe you've rolled your own, you can now use the official Xamarin.Forms expander in 4.6. Radio buttons. This one is a unique one because iOS doesn't have a radio button as a native UI component. So for the longest time, we put a flag in the ground and we said Xamarin.Forms will be the feature subsets where iOS and Android overlap. So for example, iOS doesn't have a floating action button, Android does. So we didn't add that as a control into Xamarin.Forms. We've since kind of changed our tune a little bit, and we've realized, you know what, if people want features, let's give them features. So new in Xamarin.Forms 4.6, we have the ability to do radio buttons. And yes, that is a custom, drawn radio button for iOS, whereas Android actually has native radio button UIs. Font embedding. This one's really cool. The screenshots we're looking at is actually from an app I recently released to the App Store called Get Trends. But just to show you how easy it is to add fonts now, we can take the font file, so either the .otf or .ttf file, we can put that in our .NET Standard library. And then in my .NET Standard project, I've added a couple assembly attributes where I basically copy paste the font name here, and I give it an alias. This alias can be whatever you want to call it. I just created a bunch of string constants where I've named it something that makes sense to me. And then if we want to use that font, we just assign that as the font family. For example, our label here, the GitHub logo label, I've said font family should be Font Awesome Brands. And so this is really cool. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to add a font. I struggled mightily with it the first time I ever did it, especially on, I think on iOS, it was tough because the font file doesn't necessarily match the font family, and you have to dig into that and see how iOS parses it. On Android, anytime I wanted to use a custom font like Font Awesome, I had to do a custom renderer. Now it's just super easy. We add the fonts into our .NET Standard project. We make sure that they're an embedded resource, and then we can just say, add this assembly attribute to export the font, and it just works. It's magic. It's certainly an improvement over how we used to have to do it. Media element. This is another cool one. If you ever want to play a video, media element is now controlled in Xamarin.Forms. So you can pass in a video that you've included in your project, or you can also pass in a URL if you want to stream a video. And you have two options. You can just tell the app to use the default playback controls. So if you've ever streamed a video on iOS or Android, here's what it kind of looks like on the left. Or if you want to add in your own playback controls with play buttons, stop buttons, skip forward, back, or maybe you want to force people to watch it, so you don't include a stop button. You can do that. So media elements new in Xamarin.Forms 4.6. And probably definitely my favorite is the C# markup. I've always been a big proponent of building Xamarin Forms UIs in C#. I didn't come from a background where I ever used XAML. So when I heard about Xamarin, where I can build native iOS and Android apps in C#, I said, great. And since then, I've always done my UIs in C#. And with the markup extensions, we have this beautiful new way to declare our UIs in C# that makes them so much more readable. For example, this grid here, one of the things I love with grids, we can now define rows. And so I can say that I have a row called unit type, and I have a column called label. And then when I add the children to the grid, I can explicitly call out which row and which column it goes into. So I know that this dark purple label is going into the row unit type and column label. And then taking that a step further, we can bind in line now as well. So we can just include our bindings here. We don't have to, essentially, what we used to do is new up an object, and the next line of code would be .set binding. And we can do this all in line. It is something that I knew I would enjoy, but after playing around with it, it has completely changed how I write my UIs, because now I can just glance at this grid and I know exactly what my rows and columns look like. They have specific names. And then when I glance at my children, I know exactly where to find them. All right. Now, Xamarin Forms 4.7 was recently released in preview. I think preview 2 is out right now. Well, I'll give it the Brandon thumbs up. It's actually, I'm using the preview version. I just pushed an update to my Git Trends app in the App Store yesterday, and it's running 4.7 preview without any problems. And this screenshot here on the right is actually from that app, showing you the loading placeholder and error placeholder. So we can see when this page first loads, these icons on the left have a placeholder image until the official sites, that's actually the fave icon from the website, if anybody knows what that is, until that fave icon has been downloaded and shown off. So I've always thought that this is a great idea. If you've ever used FF image loading for Xamarin Forms, these were 2 features baked into that, but now they are totally baked into the official Xamarin Forms. And probably my favorite thing with 4.7 is the ability to do multi-bindings. And as soon as I heard that this was coming, I knew exactly where I wanted to use it, because in that same app, in that Git Trends app, I had a problem where I needed to check 2 conditions to see whether or not an image should be visible. So, there's always been ways around this, where maybe in our view model, we have a property that aggregates 2 conditions and that bubbles it up. But to make it even crazier, in this binding, I also had to reference different binding contexts. So one was a view to view binding, one was a view to view model binding, and I had to do some crazy workarounds to get it working. But now we can just set it as a multi-binding, where we tell it which binding properties we want it to be aware of and watching. They can have different sources. And all we have to do is then pass in a converter. So similar to how we've always made converters with I-value converter, there's now I multi-value converter. And to be honest, the implementation here is a little hokey. I mean, I personally am not sure I could come up with a better way, but all the values are passed in as an object array. So we always want to, when we check these values in the bindings, always make sure you check that it's not null and there are values in there. And then we can cast them out. So the values come out in the same order we put them in. So I knew I added a binding for a Boolean first. So values array 0 is a bool, and then values 1, I can cast that to a double because that was the second one I passed in. And then we can check those values and determine whether or not that binding should be true or false. So really cool. And these are all available for us now in Xamarin Forms 4.7, which is in preview today. All right. So that's what's available today. There is more stuff coming. Like I said, there is Xamarin.Forms 5.x has plans for release. Oh, we're still baking and working on Maui. But so let's just jump right into it, and then I'll check back in with the host for questions, because I do have a couple of just intro slides on .NET Maui. If you haven't heard of .NET Maui yet, this was just announced last week at Microsoft's yearly developer conference called Build. We are currently releasing .NET 5. That is available now in preview. That'll be we'll take the preview tag off it later this year. Then comes .NET 6, which will include Maui. So like I said at the beginning, a lot of things we'll be chatting about today are still in the works, but this is a nice sneak peek at what's coming down the pike. So what we're doing is we're bringing Xamarin into the system library. So Xamarin.Forms will become system.maui, and Xamarin Essentials will become system.devices. And I should say Maui is actually an acronym. It's multi-platform app UI. So not only is it I think it's a cool name, but it's also it's a cool acronym too. So with .NET Maui, we will also have the ability for creating a new project from the CLI. This is something we cannot do today. There's no .NET new Xamarin, but we will be able to say .NET new Maui. We can create it from the CLI. We're also focusing on bringing support to Visual Studio Code, which is, we'll say you can do Xamarin in Visual Studio Code today, but it's just not a pleasant experience, whereas .NET Maui will make Visual Studio Code a first-class citizen. And if you still want to use Visual Studio on the PC or Visual Studio for Mac, which I know I will, we can still do File New, and the template we'll be creating here is a multi-platform app UI Maui project. And along with that, we'll also be able to say, if we still want to do just a traditional iOS or Android app, those are also available as .NET New iOS, .NET New Android, and same is true for those with Visual Studio Code. So this is where things start to really get interesting. And we'll just bring all the screenshots to the forefront, because Maui's kind of changing how us as Xamarin developers think about our cross-platform apps. So the biggest thing in Maui is everything will be in a single multi-targeted project. So what does any of that mean? Well, multi-targeting is, we'll say it's still relatively new. I shouldn't say most. A lot of libraries, so the NuGet packages that we install, for example, like Xamarin Essentials, have switched to a multi-targeted project. And we'll dive into what that looks like in code in Visual Studio, specifically Visual Studio for Mac, since I'm on my Mac today, what that looks like. But what it allows us to do is everything happens in one project. So this solution we see here, this My App, only has one CS proj, which is also named My App. And you'll notice that there isn't a myapp.ios. There isn't a myapp.android. There isn't a myapp.wpf or whichever platform you're working on. Because the way multi-targeted projects work is it pushes that onus over to the tooling. So over to Visual Studio, over to the compiler. And in the middle here, we can see a little bit how that's done. And that's because we specify that there's multiple target frameworks in this one project. And so what we have on this example, we see .NET 5 iOS, .NET 5, .NET 5 Android. So what this tells me is that my app is targeting both iOS and Android, as well as a as .NET 5 in this one project. So interesting, but like, how do we access platform-specific APIs? How do we do things like images and fonts? Well, the bottom right image shows a idea of one way to access that platform-specific code. In this example, we've put them into a folder called platforms. The folder isn't really necessary. This is a little, what's to call it, visual sugar, like syntactic sugar, but visually, really all the file needs is a way to identify that it runs on a specific platform. So in this case, we've created a file called bluetoothadapter.android.cs. That tells the compiler that when we build for Android, so for example, we can see it a little bit in the top right, if we've selected the build to be for an iPhone, then this multi-targeted project will go through and compile all the code that has this .ios.cs file extension. If we build it for Android, likewise, it'll build everything with the .android.cs. Or if there's nothing there, then there should be something there. Like if it's just .cs, if there's no iOS, Android, Windows additional moniker, then it knows that that belongs to essentially the .NET standard project. So that's your shared code. And so we can build everything together, and we'll see when we dive into the .NET MAUI code base how just cool and beneficial things become. But one of the biggest questions is then, okay, this is great, but what do I do with my resources? I have, for example, images, I have storyboards. We are still interested in what you want to see. So if you do have feedback, let us know. But what we're working on right now is a way to have it just work. So for example, we see fonts and images on the bottom left screenshot. So the fonts, this one's pretty easy because we just released this functionality in Xamarin.Forms. So this is already doable today, where we can just add in that font file, that .ttf or OTF, bring it in via an assembly attribute, and it just works. Images, this one's kind of cool because one of our engineers has been working on this cool project. I'm blanking on the name, but basically, the resizetizer. So it resizes images for us. And the idea he had is he said, what if I can just put an image into a shared project, into a .NET standard library, and then the compiler is smart enough to turn that into the 1x, 2x, 3x scaling, for example, for iOS, or for Android, the HTTPI, XHTTPI, XXHTTPI, XXXHTTPI scaling for Android. And that's the technology that we're leveraging here in MAUI, where when you click compile, those resources will be built for you. You don't have to do the scaling yourself. But like I said, all of this is the ideas we came up with and we dreamt. And I probably shouldn't be saying we, because I can't take any credit for this. People smarter than me came up with these really cool ideas. But if you have feedback, or if you want to see something that we haven't chatted about, definitely check out the MAUI open source library, add a feature request, join in one of the conversations on an existing feature request, and kind of let us know what you think. So this is probably the biggest change with MAUI versus Xamarin.Forms. And to be frank, it's long overdue, because while I love Xamarin.Forms, I've been using it both personally and professionally for probably 5 or 6 years now. I have apps in the App Store that are all built on Xamarin.Forms. It truly is my favorite. But one of the things that's always been tough is figuring out renderers. Now, I've I've been working with iOS and Android enough to where I'm familiar with the platform specific APIs. And I know once I have my UI label on iOS, for example, I know the property I want to change and how to do it, but sometimes it can be hard just to get to that native control. And a big part of that is that there's no contract, there's no interface between any of the renderers. So a label renderer on iOS could have completely different behavior than a label renderer on Android. Now, for the most part, they're pretty close. But I know the struggles I've had personally is trying to figure out where I can grab that native control, add in what I need to add, and then send it back to Xamarin.Forms. Because on a lot of things, we can, if we jump down into custom renderers, we override on element changed or on element property changed. And usually that's a good start and we can figure out where to eject it. But if you try to do that for on a navigation renderer, for example, so if you want to override how Xamarin.Forms is handling like a UI, what is it? Is it navigation view controller on iOS? Anyways, if you want to override how Xamarin.Forms is doing the navigation pages, well, they don't have an on element changed method. So that tried, true, trusted behavior you've used for overriding labels and buttons with custom renderers all of a sudden doesn't work anymore. And now you have to figure it out. Well, what's really cool with Maui is everything is going to have an interface and everything's going to have a contract. So if we create a button, it's going to inherit from iButton. So whether you are on iOS, you're on Android, you're on Windows desktop, you're on Linux, that contract will be the only thing you need to know about, or we need to know about as .NET MAUI developers to grab things like the text and the background color and do those little overrides we want to do. What makes this also really cool is that we'll be able to do a lot of this inline. So we'll check that out in our deep dive. But let's see, I think, oh, yeah, there's one more slide, the good old and more slide. Yes, .NET MAUI will support Visual Studio Code. So just like we create our Xamarin apps in Visual Studio on the PC, Visual Studio for Mac today, we'll be able to do that with .NET MAUI in Visual Studio Code. C# hot reload's also coming. This one is something I am personally crazy excited about because, like I mentioned earlier, I've never used XAML for my Xamarin.Forms UIs, and I've always been a little bit jealous of the Xamarin.Forms XAML hot reload. And so I'm super excited to see that the team was able to get C# hot reload working, and we've committed to having that available with .NET MAUI. This was, I'll say, probably harder than you might think, because one of the reasons XAML hot reload was feature added, well, say a long time ago, I think we released it last year, is because XAML is not compiled, it's JITted. And yes, there's a XAML compiler, but at its origin, at its root, XAML is an interpreted language. So you could have your compiled code running and you could make changes to the XAML and just JIT it again, just use the just-in-time compiler. So XAML was kind of the, say, first step towards our path down or introducing hot reload, because, well, we should be able to do that during runtime already anyways. Then the challenge came to, okay, we got it working with XAML. How do we get this working with C#? Because C# is a compiled language. And especially on platforms like iOS requires that everything is ahead of time compiled. So how do you have code that's ahead of time compiled, but also have code that updates live on your device? And the team did an amazing job and actually came out with a mono interpreter. So now it's not just It's not just our Xamarin code. It's not just our Xamarin.Forms code. It's not just our Maui code that's being interpreted. All of the mono code and all of the C# is now being interpreted as well to get us the C# hot reload. Obviously, this is just a debugging tool. We can't send interpreted code to the iOS App Store, for example, but this will, I know for me, be something that dramatically improves my build, deploy, developer cycle. And the last thing is we will be also supporting model view update architecture with .NET Maui. So this is something that is still pretty new in the .NET world. It's a bit of a change from MVVM, and I'll show you what that looks like in our deep dive. But if you haven't heard of it yet, model view update, it basically removes a lot of the duplicate code that we have to do in MVVM. So if you've ever written a Xamarin.Forms app in MVVM, you know you have to create a model, then you basically duplicate some of that model's properties in the view model so that the view can then be bound to it. And there's a lot of, I would say duplicate code, but there's a lot of extra overhead that we include, but we know that and we do it on purpose because MVVM is a robust architecture and it gives us the advantage of being able to swap out our UI or swap out the view model or the business logic and not affect the other. So there's a lot of benefits to adding that extra architecture. But with model view update, it kind of chops out a layer. And I'd say the biggest difference is every time there's an update, the UI is redrawn on the screen, which back in the day, when phones still weren't that powerful, this would have been pretty much impossible. Performance would have been terrible because your UI is constantly updating. Anytime somebody taps a button or somebody enters text, then we'd redraw the whole screen. That's crazy. But nowadays, phones are super powerful. This isn't a problem at all. And in fact, a lot of the cross-platform frameworks are using this. For example, Flutter's been using a model view update architecture in combination with their Skia engine, and it's proven very successful. And model view update is also being used around other communities like the React community. It's pretty big in the web community and the GraphQL community. And so I'm super excited to see this coming as we'll call a first-class citizen into C# and .NET Maui. Okay, so let me pause here because we are going to jump into some code. But first, I want to know what questions do we have about Maui, and I'll make a mental checklist and we'll see what we can get through today. So let's see, fellow meetup hosts, where can I find the questions that the community has been asking?
So far, there's one post, the Slido link. If you go on it, Brandon, you can see the questions. It's posted in the...
Okay, great. Look at that. Amazing. Okay. Oh, we got upvotes and everything. Love it. All right. So let's see. We'll still be able to use the Xamarin Essentials interface library. Shout out to Ryan Davis. Awesome library. Maui working over WebAssembly. Good question. From transition tool, similar to Android X. Also a good question. Maui overlap with Blazor WebAssembly. Nullable set to true or false. Why do they call you the code traveler? What will change for Xamarin.Forms effects? Okay, wow. So yeah, good questions. We'll knock out a couple easy ones. The code traveler is basically because I write code and I love to travel. I've spoken at a lot of conferences around the world, and when I was trying to come up with a a unique moniker that I could use for a Twitter handle and also for a website or a blog. It's like, I like the Code Traveler, and it hasn't happened yet. But I also had this ulterior motive that maybe if I do enough talk about travel, then hotels and airlines will reach out to me, give me free stuff. But that hasn't happened yet. I also haven't really started reviewing hotel rooms. My blog is all about code and Xamarin. And the nullable set to true or false, I set nullable to true everywhere. It is a bit daunting for existing projects. So I guess I should explain what is nullable if anybody hasn't heard about it. Nullable was introduced in C# 8. For reference, we are releasing C# 9 this year. So nullable is still pretty new. It's still been around less than a year, but it's the ability, or we'll say the high level goal of nullable was to get rid of null reference exceptions, because how much did those suck? Those are the worst. I know, me personally, the first app I ever pushed to the App Store is called Pun Day. If anybody likes puns, then Pun Day gives you a new pun every Monday. It's a fun game. But anyways, when I would go look at my both crash reports or handled exceptions that were popping up in Pun Day, almost all of them were null reference exceptions. And I definitely learned a lot. I learned how to write more defensive code in my Xamarin apps since then. But null reference exceptions has even been referred to by the creator of null himself as a billion-dollar mistake because of all the bugs that null has introduced into code bases. So we hate null reference exceptions, and hopefully nullable will help us end them, because by turning on nullable, and I'll show you what this looks like in, actually, do I have that code up right now? So to enable nullable, we can just come into our project and say nullable enable. And now, the next time this code compiles, it'll C#, Roslyn, the compiler, it'll start looking for any possible null reference exceptions. Now, it isn't perfect. It's not going to catch 100% of them. And as more libraries update to include nullable themselves, then these will propagate upwards into our libraries and our code. But basically what it's looking for is anytime we have introduced a variable, we haven't instantiated it, or we've set something to null, that'll get flagged as a compiler warning. And let's see if anything popped up here in this sample. Never use default value. Oh, here we go. So non-nullable field is uninitialized. Consider declaring the field as nullable. So what it's yelling at me here for is, in the constructor, I didn't initialize, well, this is a sample app, but I didn't initialize one of these fields, which is entry. And so if we actually want it to be nullable, if we want the possibility for entry to be null, we can now add a question mark here. That'll get rid of this compiler error, but then that'll also trickle down to any time we use entry. The compiler is now smart enough to look at it and say, hey, wait a minute, you haven't checked it, that's null first. So nullable is awesome. I'm a big fan. I highly recommend everybody set it to true. But the reason I say it is daunting is you enable this in a project and you're going to just be flooded with warnings. No matter how good your code is. I thought my code was perfect, and I spent probably a day going through and fixing all these possible null reference exceptions. So the good news is it helps us write better code, but it does take a little bit of effort to, let's say, modernize an existing project. For new projects, yeah, set that to true right away. That way you're good to go from the start. Okay, and then for the Blazor questions, these are good questions, and to be honest, I don't have an answer for it yet. This is something that we're looking into it. We have to figure out the best way to do it first. I'll say we really want to have Blazor, Maui unified. It'd be beautiful to have this one solution. But for the first release of .NET Maui, we are just going to focus on, or we're going to keep the focus on iOS, Android, Windows. And actually, let me bring up, just to show you, this is all part of so this is the .NET Maui repo. And if we scroll down, there's a nice little table here that shows what we are focusing on coming up. So couple nice improvements is Mac OS was possible in Xamarin.Forms, but to be frank, I never made any Xamarin.Forms apps supporting Mac OS because a lot of libraries that I was using didn't support Mac OS, and Mac OS was kind of always still coming up to speed. So it kind of forced me to use older versions of Xamarin.Forms, whereas now that'll be handled by Microsoft. So Mac OS kind of is being promoted. And likewise with Windows, we are also supporting that internally at Microsoft, whereas WPF was always possible in Xamarin.Forms, but similar to Mac OS, the code for that was always contributed from the community. So folks opening pull requests and adding support for those APIs. Whereas with .NET Maui, there will be support for WinUI. So if you haven't heard of, let's see, WinUI, it's basically a way to bring in the UI APIs so that it'll just work with UWP, WPF, or Win32 apps. So, get out of here, Zoom. There we go. So, right. So if you have any questions or you want to show off kind of what's coming with .NET Maui, this is kind of our guidelines, our roadmap right now. And let's see. So Webassembly Transition tool. I'm not sure. I know the team's looking into it. I know Android X was beautiful. The transition into Android X was very seamless for all of my existing apps. It just kind of worked. With Xamarin.Forms to Maui, I don't know, because the biggest difference from Xamarin.Forms to Maui will be the namespaces. And if we look at, for example, the GitHub repo now for Maui, if you've ever, let's do it right now. Let's look at Xamarin.Forms GitHub repo side by side. And let's see if we can truly put these side by side, because they are right now basically the same repo. So the first cut of the Maui repo has taken the existing Xamarin.Forms repo and changed the namespaces from Xamarin.Forms to system.maui. So that's why we have system.maui.controlgallery.gdk, which came from Xamarin.Forms. So we'll say in theory, yeah, sure, it should be easy to just migrate by just doing a find and replace, but we'll say TBD on that one. I know the team's looking into it. This is going to be a big transition, a big evolution forward. So it would be great if we could make it easier for everybody. So for the Xamarin Essentials interface library, this one is, well, if you haven't heard of it, we'll give a shout out here to Ryan Davis, who's just an amazing guy, amazing developer. I'm personally thankful he created this Xamarin Essentials interfaces library because I'm using it myself. But if you haven't heard of it, well, I guess we should take a step back. it adds interfaces to Xamarin Essentials. And if you haven't heard of Xamarin Essentials, Xamarin Essentials is essentially an amalgamation of all those community plugins that existed around Xamarin. So for things like, how do you access GPS from shared code? How do you access the file system from shared code? How do you turn on the flashlight from shared code? Because those are all platform specific APIs, but I want to be able to do it in my .NET Standard library. So Xamarin Essentials brought in all these existing plugins. So with one NuGet package, you have the ability to access all these platform specific APIs from shared code. And Ryan created Xamarin Essentials.interfaces that essentially provides an interface for every single Xamarin Essentials API. And this is pretty critical for if your app uses dependency injection and unit testing. So for example, with my Git Trends app, I'm writing my unit test suites now. I know I probably should have done it before I pushed the App Store, but we're good. We're catching up. And if I try to do things like access Xamarin Essentials.main thread or Xamarin Essentials.preferences, when I would call those from my unit test project, they would immediately fail because those weren't and aren't supported in .NET Core apps because, well, there's that concept of doesn't really exist for outside of say iOS and Android apps. So anyways, yeah, Ryan created interfaces so you could mock up everything like that. So if you wanted to run a test that uses a flashlight, you can just create a mock flashlight class that inherits from Xamarin Essentials interface. So we'll say TBD for this one. So to answer your question, this one's up to Ryan since he is the creator. But yeah, basically what he'll do is change those namespaces out to system.device. So I don't know if he'll release a new NuGet package called system.device interfaces, or if we'll keep using the Xamarin Essentials interfaces and maybe have some sort of compiler dependency magic going on behind the scenes, but TBD. I'll but I do love this library and I use it myself. And let's see, Xamarin.Forms effects. Okay, good question. We'll answer that when we dive into the code in just a minute. And Maui will be supported on VS for Mac at the same time as VS for Windows. I hope so too. We'll share a little bit of a background with that. The team behind the scenes has been essentially working on getting both Visual Studio on Windows and Visual Studio on Mac in lockstep by essentially combining their code bases. So there was a lot of pain early on when Microsoft first acquired Xamarin because Visual Studio for Mac wasn't the best environment. It wasn't up to par with Visual Studio, even though we named it Visual Studio for Mac, which I wasn't a proponent of making that name change as soon as they did. But what the team has slowly done is basically been combining all the backend logic that runs both, so that anytime we release new features for Visual Studio, that they'll be there on Visual Studio for Mac. We're still getting there, but .NET 5 is going to be a huge step in that direction because .NET 5 also combines .NET Core, BCL, and Mono together. So what that means is a lot of things that we used to have to wait on, like for example, when C#8 came out, it was available in the preview versions on Visual Studio on the PC, but it took a while to come to Visual Studio for Mac because we had to first wait for Mono to add in all the C#8 features. So things like that we've just kind of gotten used to, and as Xamarin developers, or especially Visual Studio for Mac developers, where we see a cool new feature come out for Visual Studio, and then we go, okay, well, let's see how long it takes to go to Visual Studio for Mac. That timeline should be drastically shortened, and hopefully by the time we hang out again around this time next year, then everything will be in lockstep, but we are working on it. We're aware of that. And a rock stable version of Xamarin.Forms. Feel free to elaborate on that question. I've used Xamarin.Forms for years. I'm using even the previews in my App Store apps, and I don't have any problems with it. So if you are running into Xamarin.Forms bugs that's causing stability problems, let me know. Hopefully you've already opened an issue on the GitHub repo. If not, go ahead and do that. Send me the link and I'll make sure to escalate that to the Forms team. And I tell you what, let's see, what time are we going to break, Jose, remind me of the schedule again?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. So the main idea is it was before to be until 7:30 and then do the Q&A, okay. But you're doing the Q&A already, so we can go on until 7:45.
All right, sounds good.
Good.
Well, let's jump into some Maui code then. So let me give a quick shout out first. So on that, let's see. So this is the website I posted for us today, where again I'll be posting a link to the recording and the slides after we're done, and I'll try to bring in some of the Q&A that we had as well. But in here, I want to point you to this video here. This is where I personally learned a ton about what's coming in Maui, and I'm going to do my best to channel my inner James Clancy to show this off today. But what James and Sweeky do is diving deep into Maui, how it works, how these abstraction layers, how the renderers all work. And hopefully we'll get through a lot of that today. But if you do want to keep going and diving deeper into Maui, do check out this video. Like I said, it's 2 hours long, but I put on some coffee, I cranked this up to 2x speed, and I got through it no problem. It felt like the time flew by because this is really cool stuff. All right, so let's check Maui out, and let's bring up some font sizes here. So what we are looking at, these are, I don't even know what the word, these are very hot bits. The Maui open source repo doesn't have some of these bits in it yet. So I guess you would call these even like pre-alpha. They're so hot, but we mentioned the new way of doing renderers. So one of the problems with renderers was that, well, I guess there's a couple problems. So we had to do all the renderers in the platform specific libraries. So that's kind of a pain. We had to leave our .NET standard library, go to platform specific, say like myapp.android, implement it there. We would have to do that using, or once we finish that custom renderer, we would add in the assembly attribute that then tells Xamarin.Forms to include it. And like we mentioned earlier, there was no consistency between renderers. There was no contract that said the label renderer will do this like this, and so will the button renderer, or anything like that. So it's kind of this wild west of how does Android implement it for Xamarin.Forms? How does iOS implement it for Xamarin.Forms? I don't know. And a lot of times I know personally, I would just jump into the Xamarin.Forms source code, see how they implemented it there, and then bring that new knowledge back to my app and kind of follow their lead. So the nice thing with Maui is the idea we have, this is called slim renderers, and it inverts how renderers work in Xamarin.Forms. So let's check this out. What do I mean by this? So first of all, everything's going to have an interface. Actually, you know what? let's back up a little bit because we are in a multi-targeted project. So let's first talk about that, because otherwise some of this stuff won't make sense. So yeah, let's ignore that. But let's look at, where is label renderer? There we go. So check out this label renderer. And actually, let me bump up the text size there. Fonts. Let's make this a little bit bigger. There we go. Now we can read it. We lost that font size. All right. So check out this label renderer folder. This label renderer folder has label renderer.cs, .android.cs, .macios.cs, and so on and so forth. And the way this works with multi-targeted libraries, when I build for iOS, the project is looking for everything that is either .cs or .macios. And macios, this sounds a little weird, but the iOS and macOS APIs have so much overlap that's actually easier to do them together with, I think these have a little bit of, like one or two compiler directives in it to point it between mobile and desktop. But right, so when I build for iOS, it's going to look for all the files that end in .macios.cs and include those. And it's not going to build for Android. It's not going to build for Win32. So this way we can have everything in the same project. Now, because everything's in the same project, this is where things get cool. This is where we'll see our build times improve, and hopefully, I won't make any promises for performance, but I will say performance is definitely the goal. It'll hopefully improve in performance as well. One of the big performance problems that Forms had actually was that export attribute that we would add to the top of our custom renderers, or renderers in general. Attributes are expensive, they're slow, and I'll defer to James Clancy for the exact number, but I believe he said that those attributes accounted for about half of the startup time on Android, for example. So just by ripping out those attributes, we should gain a nice performance bump. But all right, so where are we? We are in a multi-targeted library where we can now combine shared code with our platform-specific code. And the way that's done is using partial classes. So what is a partial class? Well, in C#, maybe you've used them, maybe you haven't, maybe you've never even heard of them. But C# allows us the ability to have two classes named the same thing. So let me pull up, let's look at these side by side. Boop. And let's make these a little bit bigger. So these two classes are both called public partial class label renderer, public partial class label renderer. And this has been a thing that's been available in C# for, well, I don't know how long, but at least since I became aware of it about 5 or 6 years ago. I never really used it because I never really saw the point to it. I was like, okay, I could split up my code between two classes, but why bother? I'll just put them in one class. But with the multi-targeted projects, this becomes so incredibly valuable because now we have these two classes, which at compile time, when we compile for iOS, will just be built as one class. And so a couple of things to point out. Let me see if I can, there we go. I'm gonna hide everybody's lovely faces on the video so I can get a little bit more screen real estate on my side. But what we'll see here is, let's make this a little bit bigger too. Boop. So this label renderer on iOS, these all inherit from abstract view renderer. We'll check that out a little bit later. But what we have the ability to do now is we can access all of the native platform controls here in this .macOS iOS shoot. .macios.cs project. So when we look at things like, let's see, as native, so native label, if we scroll up a little bit, the team has cheated a little bit and used a using statement to say native label is going to be UI label. So if you've ever done anything iOS specific and you wanted to put a label on the screen, so a text box on the screen, you know that iOS, the native API that is UI label. Likewise on Android, similar idea, but now we're talking about the Android widget text view. And again, we can do some cool things with compiler directives to make sure Android X versus the old Android support libraries are being used. But all right, so now we have access to everything we want to do with that UI label. And we see here that there's a lot of these overridden methods. So this abstract view renderer, this contract of iLabel force us to do some things. So actually, let's dive into iLabel. There we go. So iLabel also inherits from iText, but adds in this line height as a double. iText inherits from iView and expands on that by saying anything that inherits from iText has to implement a way to, well, set the text as a string, the color for the text type. And we can keep going down this rabbit hole when we get to iView, because now there's things like is enabled, background color, frame, all those things that we kind of know and love from our Xamarin.Forms days. But actually, let's see. Do we want to get into view renderer just yet? We can at least look at the contract. So view renderer will make sure we have a UI view, and then we also have the ability to add in our virtual methods here. But zooming back out, the way these renderers will work is on the shared code side. So jumping back to this is label renderer. So this code, again, this is our shared code. This code is included in when we compile for iOS, it's included when we compile for Android. And what we do now is we just tell our label renderer how to do everything we want. So we know, for example, that there is going to be a map property text method in both the iOS.cs class, the Android.cs class. And so we can tell it that anytime a label's text is referenced or changed, this is how you do it. So we go to this map property text. Oh, and there's our there's our label renderer class. But if we look at we should do these side by side. Boop. So when Maui needs to do something with text, it checks this. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Come here. There we go. It checks this property mapper dictionary and says, hey, I need to do something with text. How do I do it? And it knows it can go to, slide this back over. Come on. One more try. 2 more tries. There we go. It knows it can find all that information here in the map property text method. So let me combine these two, because the next question I know I had when I first saw this was, wait a minute, like, why are we doing like this property mapper? This seems really heavy. This feels like a big add. I thought we were improving performance. Well, if you've ever dove into the Xamarin.Forms source code to see how Xamarin.Forms is doing renderers, well, you'll eventually come across a method called on element property changed. And that method was usually just massive, because what on element property change did was it was the engine that would essentially check anytime I notify property change fired to see what that property name was. So because that property name comes in as a string, and that string maps to a a C# property. So, a global variable property. On element property change would be this huge if else statement where it would say, if the property name is equal to background color, do this. If that property name is equal to height, do this. If that property name was equal to width, do this. And this is where a lot of our, what's the word I'm looking for? It's where a lot of the differences came in between how maybe Android implemented the label renderer versus iOS, or maybe how iOS did a button renderer versus a label renderer, because all these unique properties had to be checked, and we didn't really have a contract in place that kept that consistent. So now we do. We have our interfaces. All these interfaces will have these specific properties associated with them. And so the reason we're moving to this property manager is to get rid of those those if else or switch statements, because one of the things you'll find is if you make, this is kind of just a fun fact about C# in general, but the way the compiler works, it will try to optimize some of our code. So if we had a huge long list of if else statements, so if this, else if this, else if this, else if this, and I think the magic number, if I remember correctly, is 5. I think once that if else statement got above a certain number, let's say it's 5, the compiler would actually turn that into a switch for us. So there was already some improvements there that C# just does for us. We get them for free. And then if that switch grows too big, and I don't know what the magic number for how many case statements we need in the switch for this to happen, but eventually the compiler will take the switch and turn it into a dictionary in the compiled code for us, because, well, dictionaries use key value pairs. They're pre-indexed. So when we need to pull something out of a dictionary, it's already indexed and we can pull it out at 0.1 speed, if you remember of our big O calculations. So basically reading from a dictionary is almost instantaneous. So what we're doing here, we essentially learned from those optimizations and said, let's just skip over all of that. So let's not even write the code and rely on the compiler to do those optimizations for us. Let's just start with dictionaries. And that's where this property mapper comes into play. So when I guess one way to think about it, how will we use property mappers? Because obviously this is the Maui source code. So this is how Maui's creating labels. But let's say we wanted to add in our operating system. We wanted to add support for, let's see, I know Samsung has added support for Xamarin.Forms for their Tizen platform. Maybe, I don't know, Sony wants to add in an operating system for their TVs. Well, all they have to do is create these methods to map the interface property to a method that handles it. And then when we run our .NET Maui code on this new operating system that was just introduced, well, Maui's still just calling iLabel, and all of this is being handled underneath the hood for us. Whew, okay, let me take a breath and jump back to the questions, because I want to see what's everybody talking about, what has popped up. Probably close all these tabs and let's see, find my chat again. So I can, let's see, Zoom, chat, questions. There we go. All right, let's see what folks are chatting about. Do you expect performance improvements? So yeah, Adamos, that's the plan. I don't want to make any promises today, but there definitely won't be any performance degradations. But the exact numbers for performance are TBD. But yes, obviously that's the forefront and pretty much has been for Xamarin.Forms for a while now. will be possible to embed Maui into native iOS and Android apps, basically having the bindings into the opposite C# to Maui. I think I know what you're talking about. And let me see. I forget if this sample project had it in here. Let's see. There we go. So yeah, what's kind of cool with this, and if I've understood your question properly, we're talking about what if I want to still create my app the traditional iOS Android way. I mean, I know I hear you. I personally love using iOS storyboards, and I've made apps that are not in Xamarin.Forms. And I mean, the ability to drag and drop in a storyboard is just beautiful, although constraints are a different story. But yeah, so with Maui, at least the way we have it right now, everything can be converted to a native view. So for example, this app.main page in this example, let's see, go to declaration. So main page is, actually, it's still using the Xamarin.Forms namespace. How about that? So main page is Xamarin.Forms.page. It's the page that we know and love. Or maybe you're more familiar with content page. Content page just inherits from page. But long story short, yeah, if we just say as a content page.content.toNative, that'll turn it into a UI view. So maybe we have an existing app, we've built it using storyboards, and we want to add kind of a simple page. Like a common example I've seen in apps that do this is maybe there's an about page. And the about page is just kind of some text about, maybe here's the terms of service, here's the version number, here's our support email. So it's not really a page that requires any like crazy custom animations or anything platform specific. So simple pages like that, I've seen teams create that in Xamarin.Forms, or in the future, with .NET MAUI. And then you just take that and say, take that Xamarin.Forms content page and just say to native on it, and you'll get the UI view. So that's exactly how we're doing it here in this sample. We're actually just newing up a view controller and passing in our main page as the content. Again, TBD on whether this will be the official way we'll initialize .NET MAUI apps going forward, but this is where we love getting your feedback and let us know what you think. So hopefully we're on the same page there with embedding that native MAUI into iOS and Android apps. So, but yeah, it should be super easy. Gradually migrate to MAUI one project at a time. I don't know. I know the namespaces are going to change. So I think what'll be and I'm guessing a little bit, right? Because we're forecasting, can't see the future. But if we are able to create a tool that, like Android X, what was the Android X migration tool? Android recently moved away from releasing features in what's called the Android support libraries, because they said that's too confusing. Nobody can keep up to date with these support libraries. We need to make it easier for our Android developers. So what they did, they took the support libraries and broke them down into even smaller libraries. So instead of having like, I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say 20 or 30 Android support libraries that we could pick and choose from, add them to our apps. They broke those down into even granular libraries via, if you've heard keywords like Android X or Jetpack. And now there's hundreds of these Android X libraries. So does it help? Maybe in some cases, maybe not in other cases. But to make that transition easy for Xamarin developers, the Android team did an amazing job. They basically created a tool that if we were building for Android 10, Android Q, then the compiler would take any Android support library that it saw in our code or any of those namespaces and convert that to an Android X namespace for me automatically. So I didn't have to do anything. I've slowly gone through my code and switched out any Android.support to Android X or whatever the equivalent is. But yeah, underneath the hood, it kind of just works. So we'll see what the team's able to do, but having something like that would be amazing for Maui. But TBD, I will say, if you haven't already, jump into the .NET Maui open source library and check to see if anybody's mentioned that as a feature request, because I know I would love to have that, and I will happily upvote and advocate for that feature internally myself. Thoughts on using interfaces with default implementations versus partial classes for the contracts? Oh man, that's I still don't really have an opinion on default interfaces or default implementations for interfaces. If anybody's unfamiliar, in C#8, which again still pretty new, just came out last year or just released less than a year ago, we can come into interfaces and I can give this a default implementation. Now, that's a property. So if we had, maybe we had a method in here, I could actually do something in this implementation of this method. So if anybody inherits from iLabel and they did not implement this init method, it just will revert back to my default implementation. So they definitely have their use, especially updating older interfaces so you don't break contracts with existing code, especially if you don't own the code base end to end. It's an easy way to say, like, you can swap out the logging in your logging interface, for example, and nobody really knows. Or rather, you don't, not that you're trying to hide anything, but rather you don't want to break anything. So yeah, I mean, I like default implementations. I can see their use, but you can also get into some trouble because you can now have what's called the diamond dependency problem, where you could have your code down here referencing, or your class can reference more than one interface. And if those two interfaces implement a method that references the same library, but maybe a different version, well, now you've just created this, what's called a diamond dependency, and you've essentially broken your code. So you can get into some trouble, but I'm curious to see what the future will be with default interfaces versus abstract classes, because now we have this overlap. But I'll say I like them. I see the use case for them, but be careful with default interface implementations. Meant something different to generate libraries included. Oh, to turn your C# code into Swift and Java. I have no idea. I'd say, again, check out while we're talking about it, check out the .NET Maui repo. Make sure to open up an issue there if there isn't one that already exists, to make sure it's on the team's radar. And again, feel free to send me the link for issues you want to get some visibility, and I can make sure to poke the team internally. So circling back to effects, hopefully I've done a decent enough job explaining Maui so far that you see kind of how to implement this code for effects. So effects are basically lighter weight custom renderers. And that is, for Maui, basically custom renderers, effects, all of that will change or be slimmed down. That being said, the Xamarin.Forms libraries, as we have them today, are still there. So we'll see how it goes forward during the transition, but there could also be I could see a world where we still have effects and custom renderers, what will then be called the old way of doing it, because the Xamarin.Forms libraries are still there. But I would say once, maybe not the first preview, but I'll say once we've got a couple previews of Maui out there, so probably maybe this time next year, I would, and I will, I plan on updating my libraries. So any NuGet packages I have to flip those namespaces and add that Maui support. And around shell, I do not use shell. I don't have anything bad to say about it. Rapito in the comments was mentioning that there are as many bugs as features. Ugh, so that's not good. But I'm kind of a crunchy old Xamarin.Forms developer. I've been doing it since the Xamarin.Forms 1 days. And shell, I like shell, but it's always, for me, it's solved a problem that, it's solved a problem that I didn't have. You know, by the time shell came out, I was already so intimately familiar with how navigation worked and how tab layouts and master detail pages that I'd already been through the pain of learning those to figure those out and get them working. That creating a new app without shell wasn't a problem for me. But yeah, I do love how much they've simplified it. So thanks for following up, Rapito. All right, so let's jump back into some Maui code here. All right, so we talked about some interfaces. We talked about, let's see, get me out of this giant view here. Let's, what can we jump into? So the sample here is actually just basically Xamarin Forms. It doesn't really take advantage of all of the Maui, the Maui-ness. So it's basically what I'm trying to say is it's still using kind of the MVVM approach. So let me pivot for a second and, well, actually, let me introduce something first. So on that website I put together for us, let's see. And don't worry, I'll give you the chance to grab this link again before we're done. But I've also included a link to Comet. So what is Comet? Well, Comet is kind of where all of this started. About a year ago, we have, well, we'll back up a little. At Microsoft, we have something called a 1 week where basically Microsoft gives us the ability to, I won't say not work on our jobs or our current projects, but gives us the flexibility to essentially spend a week focusing on something new, something we've always wanted to do or try out or play around with. So maybe for me next year, that'll just be playing around with Maui. But if you're a really smart guy like James Clancy here, you can see we're in James Clancy's repo. He and another one of our developers came up with this idea for Comet. And Comet was kind of inspired by Swift UI. If you hadn't heard of Swift UI, iOS came out with this almost like a Xamarin.Forms-esque library for Swift. But here, let me play this video and we'll crank up the speed here, because what's the point of watching something on YouTube if you can't crank it up to 2x? But what we see is, first, everything's being done in C#. We have C# hot reload running. Like, we have this automatic updates on our iOS emulator. And there's kind of this fluent syntax for creating this app. And combined with that is the concept of MVU. So I'm pivoting towards how do you do a Maui app with MVU now? And because we're still working on the Maui repo, we're going to leverage the existing Comet repo to show it off, because, oh no, should have at least freeze framed at the end there. There we go. So Comet was kind of the first experimental project. Clancy took that week and said, hey, let's see if we can even do this. And he did. Like I said, he's a really smart guy. But Clancy did was do everything MVU first. And I have another sample app that will open up where I was playing around with Comet, and that'll give us a chance to look at how this MVU stuff works. So let's see, flip over to the Comet branch. And don't worry about memorizing anything. All of this code's open source, and I'll make sure to add a link to this specific sample, including the link that I've already added for Comet. But let's start out. All right, looks like everything's initialized. So similar to the Maui example we saw earlier, where we took our Xamarin.Forms content page and just said to native, I think it was just to native, if I remember correctly. And Comet is where that idea first originated, where we can say just to view controller. And so we're passing in that, in this case, this is what does Comet call it? This is a Comet view. We're passing that into the native view controller. So actually, let me show you, what does this app look like first? It's always helpful to see what does the app do before we into how it works. Building. Still building. Okay. Oh, there it goes. Quick question check. Oh, did I lose my questions again? I'm really good at navigating away from those. Okay, cool. Still deploying. Come on, Android, you can do it. Well, the app's called Geo Locator, and it's just basically using the Xamarin Essentials library to pull in the GPS coordinates. So this is a simple app that I made because, like I mentioned earlier, I love traveling, and especially when I'm on planes, I'm always curious, where in the world are we? And certain apps like Google Maps, if it can't figure out your exact location, oh no, I didn't finish polishing that. Well, if I did a better job with this UI, you would see the complete lat long here, your altitude, and then the accuracy all in meters. Shame on me for not fixing that before, for sure enough. Well, anyways, so it's just a one-page app that essentially will just pull this is 1 second to get your location and update it on the screen. So again, this is the idea that we have and the plans we have for Maui. If you have feedback, let us know. But MVU, model view update. So the way we architect these apps is we have a couple of things going on here. So we have this state, we have this body, and let's see, is anything else new? Okay, so those are probably the two new keywords if we're coming from the Xamarin.Forms world. So body, this is how we generate our view. So if we use the attribute body, then there's some compiler magic that tells us this is essentially, it's like the content for our content page is a Xamarin.Forms equivalent. And so here I've just created a couple labels. So I made these classes down here where we can set the color, the font, the margins. So all things that, if we're coming from Xamarin.Forms, should look and feel familiar, although the syntax is a little different. What's cool with this syntax is it can also all be done in line. So I didn't have to do this custom class. I could have said .color right here, and it would still work. I just chose to do it as a nested class to, I don't know, I like the way it looked. I like how this was a little bit cleaner, but yeah, we couldn't just chain these all in the initialization here. And our label text, we are passing in a string, but that string depends on this location state value. So this location state is up here. It's part of our state. And this location value is just the Xamarin Essentials location. So this is where I'm getting the latitude, longitude, there's longitude, lat long, altitude, accuracy. This is all kind of being done for me via Xamarin Essentials. And it's all happening in this method here. So the way this works, the way MVU works is anytime our state object has changed, in this case, Comet, but again, in the future, this will be .NET MAUI, comes in and basically reruns this method again. So notice how this is a method. It's a function that can be run and we can get the updates that way. So basically, anytime location state changes, so when I say down here that location state.value is equal to this geolocation service.getLocation, this internally is handling all the iNotify property change. We don't have to worry about any of that. You can see that I'm not inheriting anywhere here from iNotify property changed. So kind of it's helping us break that dependency on it. Although if you dig down to the source code, it's still using that as the methodology. But right, when this value changes, because it's part of our state, this tells our MVU architecture, generate the body again. So it comes through and updates all of these values and redraws the UI. So that at its core is the simplest explanation behind MVU, is that you don't have to, you basically get to reuse your models. So this location model, I didn't have to create a separate view model. I didn't have to break out the latitude, altitude, accuracy into strings in my view model that then propagated to the view. We can essentially leverage our existing models and cut out that view model overhead. I won't say we're not cutting out the view model layer because that business logic will still exist, but we can at least streamline our code a little bit and get rid of a little bit of that extra cruft. So what's happening here is when this class is initialized, I kick off this start location services method. Say fire and forget's just this is just an extension method I wrote that will kick off a task without awaiting it. Well, it'll kick off a task inside of an async void method, which allows us to essentially do a fire and forget. So the task is still awaited inside of async void, but it allows us to essentially safely fire a task where we cannot use the await keyword. But anyways, so what's happening is every second-ish, because our task.delay isn't always exactly 1 second, it's say approximately 1 second. But yeah, every time this value, the value of value updates, because we said that this is our state, that is what kicks off this update for the UI. So if we're breaking down what is model, what is view, what is update, this would be our view. Model, this would be our model. And well, I guess this is also where we're updating it too. But let me touch on, we'll keep that there. So like I mentioned earlier, what if we have a really complex UI, right? Like this is pretty simple. We've got 6 pieces of text we're updating. Well, as our views grow and we start making, we'll say real apps instead of this sample app that didn't even look too great because I didn't finish aligning and giving spacing to the text, shame on me. But the plan for .NET MAUI is to be able to essentially use diffs. So in the same way if we're using Git and we commit code to a repo, every time we commit code, it doesn't take our whole new file and upload it to GitHub, it looks at it and says, okay, what has changed, and gets the diff, so the difference between the old file and the new file, and then stores that. And so that's one of the ways Git is so efficient. And that's what we're looking into and planning for Maui, is that if we only update, like, let's say only this is geolocation. So I guess if we were walking along flat ground and the altitude never changed, but our latitude and longitude value did change, then the only UI update that would happen would be for the latitude and the longitude. So we'll leave it there because we are coming up closer to the end of today's session at the top of the hour, but I do highly recommend watching Clancy and Sweeky's deep dive. And he goes a little bit more into in-depth into how this is done, the plans for implementing those diffs. And then he also touches on some gotchas. So he points out there's a couple things that if we as developers don't do it, I won't say don't do it properly, but if we do it in a way that's not recommended, then then .NET Maui won't be able to do diffing, and which could cause some, we'll say, self-induced pain down the road for anybody not following the best practices for model view update. But do check those out. I mean, we are working on tools to make this hopefully pretty seamless, but let's see, jump back to the questions real quick. XAML and the MVU pattern. Ooh, I'm glad you asked that. So right, let's zoom out a little bit. The existing Xamarin.Forms libraries, whether you create the UI in C# like I love doing, or you create the UI in XAML, that will still be available. So Xamarin.Forms, as we know it today, is literally, literally has been copy pasted into the .NET Maui repo. Just the only difference being the namespace from Xamarin.Forms.button, for example, to system.maui.button. So yes, XAML support will still be there. MVVM support will still be there, but the MVU pattern is, we'll say, at least as of today, this is a C# first approach. So right now, there's not a XAML MVU framework that, or at least that I'm aware of. Things could change. Now is the time to make sure that you get your feedback into the team. If you want to open up an issue and chat about it with the Maui team, now's the time to do it. But yeah, the whole concept of MVU is C#. And honestly, like, if you ever looked at XAML behind the scenes, XAML actually gets turned into C# anyway. So it's kind of, XAML was always almost like an abstraction layer over C# in the first place. But right now MVU is code first. But again, get your feedback in now while the team's still working on the spec, and we have the flexibility to essentially implement Maui however we as the community come to a consensus on. All right, so that was a lot of me talking, so I'll go ahead and pause. But if you haven't had a chance yet, here is the link again to the resources from today. So I'll make sure to add in the link to the recording once it's become available, and I'll upload the slides. And that way you can share this link with anybody who couldn't make it today. I will also post this link. I'll leave it as a comment on the meetup page. So even if maybe somebody got the times mixed up and thought the meetup was tomorrow, they can see the link on the page, and then they'll be able to see the recording as well. So share it with your friends, coworkers, anybody that couldn't come today. And again, my Twitter handle is the Code Traveler. So if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me a direct message. Can't promise I'll know all the answers, but hopefully I'll be able to at least steer you in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brandon. I would like, Michael, you have the capability to unmute the audience?
The audience?
Yes, so...
Yes, so...
Uh-oh.
Good. We have a loop there, so let's give an applause.
Let's give an applause.
What's a Zoom meeting?
But yeah, well, was close. Thank you, Brandon, and there you have a bit of a audience applause for you. Thanks for
Thank you.
us today. Now I will end that right now, the stream. So thank you everybody for attending, and the stream is finished. So now we